This is House Planning Help episode 243. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, architect and author Sarah Susanka returns to the podcast. It's been way too long, probably 5 years. She's behind the Not So Big series of books, and I need to come clean that my house, rather than getting smaller through the process, actually got a little bit bigger. Why did that happen? Well, I thought she's a great guest to discuss this with. She's also got good advice that I did embrace. I think this house has got a lot to be said for it. And as I mentioned, we'll discuss this in a few moments. Before then, I'm just back from the Healthy Buildings Conference, something I haven't mentioned on the podcast, so I thought I must put a plug in for this because it was excellent. One interesting aspect, though, was that the keynote wasn't actually anything to do with construction. It was a sailor who came and gave it. Emily Penn, I'm wondering whether to get her on the podcast, actually. And it was all about plastics. And as a sailor, when you start going around the world, I think you discover, oh my goodness, what is this in the sea? Plastics. And something I didn't realize is, although plastic doesn't break down, it breaks into tiny little pieces, and that is part of the problem because these tiny pieces, they get everywhere inside the fish, down to the seabeds, into our lives as well, not just out at sea. They get into our food, into our dust, everything like that. So huge problem. Yet another thing, we think of climate change, we think of pollution, we think of extinction of animals, and I'm putting plastics on this list now as, oh my goodness, what are we doing? How are we going to create this new economy where everything sort of works with the planet rather than against it? You know, that's our ongoing mission. Okay, question for you. How big should your house be? You're thinking about building a house. It's right up there, really is. How much space do you need? You've got to answer this. I know you don't have to have a solid answer on day one, and that's why today's guest will have a ton of tips for you. I found my first chat very, very valuable, and you'll hear about that in a moment. So let's catch up with her then. It's architect and author Sarah Susanka. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Ben.
Yeah, this is great. And one of the reasons I wanted to get you back onto the podcast is because I have built a house now.
Well, congratulations. Is it not so big?
Well, this is part of what I want to talk about because there were a few issues along the way. However, what I really appreciated about our last chat is that actually some of your advice really stuck with me as I went through, which is interesting because I had lots of conversations and I can't always say that I can remember what I was talking about with a certain person, but with you, there were some really clear messages. It was very valuable. So you probably want to know about the size of the house first of all, which I think I need to deal with just to let you know that actually I ended up going bigger than I thought I was going to. So I don't know whether you work in square meters, but floor area, 226 square meters.
Oh, gosh, I don't. Let me just convert that for myself. 226 square meters. Somebody in your listening audience is going to be able to do this instantly, but I can't. Will it let me do that? Yeah, so that's not big by our standards. That would be 741 square feet, I think.
Well, I think it might be a bit more than that.
Oh, maybe that's just, you know what I bet that is? So I now need to multiply it by...
We're starting with a big maths equation here. I didn't expect that to happen.
I can't do it quickly. Oh, well, I'll have to do it another time, but I believe you. Anyway.
The purpose of me saying that is because when we started thinking about having a smaller house. We did want that within budget and all the rest of it. But what we found is that we were led a little bit by the land that was available. So on this particular piece of land, the permission that had been granted for it was for a much bigger house. So I've pretty much halved the size of the house that was on this site. But I just thought that that was really interesting, that you're guided a little bit by what land, what lot, I guess you guys call it, you go for. Does that make sense? Because that wasn't something I knew about beforehand.
Well, it is to some degree. You know, it's an interesting phenomenon that when you're building to a piece of property, the property governs a lot of what you can and can't do. And so, one of the things that architects are very much aware of is that, for example, if you wanted to be able to purchase a floor plan and just build it, it doesn't convert automatically to the piece of property that you have. In fact, it's very rare that a pre-made plan is going to fit exactly the piece of property that you have. So a big part of what my profession exists for is to help make a house that really grows out of the site very naturally. So yes, the site has an enormous impact on the character of house that you can build.
And where we were, it's a slightly unusual situation. We have something called greenbelt lands here, which is what you can't build on. And one of the great joys of where I am is that because we have most of our piece of land as a greenbelt and you can't build on it, it naturally means that you have to take advantage of that small bit of land that you can build on for it almost to sit as the right size property on there.
I see. Yes, absolutely. And so did your property have some elevation change?
It's fairly flat, but it's part of a neighbouring property, or it was before. Okay. So we're effectively building in their garden plus a bit of a field.
I see.
Every place is different, isn't it? But what we did follow, one piece of advice you gave me, which I tell loads of people, and no one ever seems to value it as much as I have valued it, was about using all the space every day. And so although we've got this slightly bigger house than perhaps we originally set out to, with the exception of one room, which I can say today it's a guest room that is being used. We've got one dedicated guest room. All of the house, all of that space, I have my office, the kids have their rooms, we've got our main room. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about where that came from and why it works so well, because I love it.
Oh, okay. Can you just repeat, Ben, for a second? The key idea here was the
to use all the space every day.
Yes. So, I got this really from being in the US and looking at how many rooms almost never got used. That wasn't true where I grew up in England, but it was certainly true here. And so I found, isn't this crazy? They're building more and more square footage, or, square meters in your case, and not really using it every day. And so I could see that there was a way to build a house that was smaller, but also better because it was alive. That if every space is in use every day, you don't feel like you've got an appendage that's not used for anything.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I started this idea of doing double duty. It's a little bit like in a Japanese house. We know, they'll use a dining area as a sleeping space, but we have other things that we can convert from one space to another. A very common one that I do is if you've got a guest bedroom, unless you have guests very frequently, that room sits empty most of the time. So why not use it for an in-home office, for example, or what I call an away room, a place to put kids playing computer games or noise that you'd rather have isolated. Let them use that space. And then when you do have a guest over, it can easily transform into its occasional function that's its what it's named for, but doesn't get used very frequently for that purpose.
And I can tell you right now, this is another one that I massively embrace. So I'm talking to you from my office, but right behind me is a sofa, which turns into our sofa bed when we have guests. Yeah, it's technically a 4-bedroom house, dedicated bedrooms. And then we've got one that we can have here. I've got my mother-in-law and my son downstairs in the snug, which is, again, another room that will convert into a bedroom if we decided to host quite a few people. And then the kids can double up in their own room. So one kid can go with the other kid. And then you've got another room there. So yeah, I just think that. So I'm marveling in your advice.
That's great. Well, congratulations. It does work. And I know that I have saved a lot of people from building rooms that really they don't need, but never really thought about before.
Do you think that this is just some people living like this, or have we gone through a change in how we use our houses, because our main space is what you talk about, the more open plan space that can have different zones in there.
I can't say that everybody has embraced this. I think that there's always going to be a variety of different types of folk looking for different types of houses. But I think that there is a much wider acceptance of what I say is building better rather than bigger. And in the UK, I don't know how often it is that people do build bigger, but I can tell you in this country, given the option, in the US market, people tend to spread out. We've got more space to spread out into, and so houses got crazy big. And I know that I've had an impact on helping people to reassess what actually fits them. We don't buy a bigger piece of clothing just because we can. In the same way, we don't need a bigger house just because we can. Let's tailor it so that it really fits us. And I think that idea has really caught on.
Is it status symbol? Is that one part of it?
That's a big piece. And again, I can only talk about, values that I've seen here. But I know that for a long time, people wanted a better house and equated better with bigger. And I actually had one client who could pretty much afford whatever he wanted to build. And he was going for the bigger house. And he had started working with another architect. And I saw the plans and I was just frankly horrified. It was not a pretty thing. And so I challenged him and I said, look, I would like to design a house for you that's half the size of what you've got shown here, but that's really the coolest house, the most interesting house. And I guarantee your friends and neighbors are going to want to come and visit because it's going to be really enjoyable to be in. And of course, the project wasn't without its hitches, with moments of his worrying that it was smaller than other people's. But he actually ended up loving the house. And it's absolutely was when it was finished, it was the talk of the neighborhood, and people did gather there a lot. So I think it's questioning some of those values. But once people see what you can do when you spend money effectively rather than just on more, they're sold. It's instant. It's obvious.
Money is a huge part when you tackle a project like this, and we went over budget. I imagine a lot of people do, particularly those first-timers.
Everybody does, but most people don't tell you.
They keep that quite well. I've been podcasting about it, so there's no great secret here. I'm shocked with how much more we've spent. But I don't think we've been excessive. I love the way that when we came into the house, it felt like home straight away, just because of all the thought and maybe watching the space develop day by day as well. That's a big bonus, isn't it, of going smaller? If you can stop yourself. We're not saying that everyone wants to live in a tiny house, but what budget advice do you give people when they're going through this process?
Well, this is actually where this process starts, because when I was, helping a lot of homeowners to build a new house, they would come in and they'd show me these gorgeous pictures from magazines. Nowadays, it would be, from things like Pinterest and the web. But they had a budget that was limited. And then they would say, and I want such and such size. And I knew from the first meeting that with those pictures and that budget and that amount of square footage or meters, they could not build their house. And so I had to figure out a way to help them obviously the budget is not likely to change. The quality of what they could build could change, or the quantity. And of course, most people who were coming to an architect, they cared about the quality. So I had to figure out a way to show them how to build less quantity, but get a better house. And so that's really where the Not So Big House movement started. I was beset by this conundrum with almost every client. And so just helping people to see what they don't need to build because they're really not using it anymore. Like in this country, formal dining rooms are rarely used, but everybody used to build them. Nowadays, not so much because of the impact of these books. But it's just allowed people to think outside the box and create a house that's really tailored to them rather than some sort of generic idea of how we live.
Yeah, I think there's some sound advice in there, certainly. One of the things that I found going through the project is when you've got your designs together, let's say you have overspent, how do you go back? You know, if the advice was you need a smaller house, it's actually very difficult when you're so attached to what you've got to go back. So do you think it is a case of just being brave and saying, I've spent all this money on these plans so far, let's rip them up and try again?
Well, you're asking a very, very difficult question. And it's a really common question because people do get overstretched many times. There's a lot of different solutions. One is in the design process itself, and this is something that I try to do when I'm working with a client and they know what they want. I try to build in what I call safety valves, places where you can cut back if you need to. So, for example, you might say, well, we could build this porch or sunroom now, but if you need to save a chunk of money, this is something that you could do later. That's one approach. It doesn't usually work that way. When push comes to shove, they tend to end up building what they want and finding the resources. But it's, I suspect you went through some of this.
Yes.
Other thing you can, instead of granite countertops, you do something less expensive for the first 10 years you're living there, and then you upgrade later. There's things that you can do like that. But once you've got the plans, if it's really way overpriced, there's no way you're going to be able to afford it. I would say then treat this as an expensive lesson and go back to the drawing board and start over. And sometimes you can start over with working with the same person. Sometimes it may be the chemistry between you and the person that you're working with that's not really right. But you will have learned an incredibly valuable lesson going through that. And I can tell you, I've worked with a lot of people who've actually done that, even though it sounds heart-wrenching to have all of your dreams embodied in a plan and then to put it aside and say, we've got to start over. But sometimes that is what's required.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of wisdom in, as you say, we've tried to keep this house quite simple. So there were elements when we looked at value engineering, bringing the cost of it all down. So we could have built the garage afterwards. We've got a balcony as well. We could have done that at a later stage. We decided to plow ahead because we thought about the disruption and we're in a financial position that we could. We changed the specification of a couple of things. And I'll give you an example. The driveway, we saved about £30,000 by taking the spec down. And it's one of the things that bugs me a bit just because it's so noisy. It's loose gravel and goes everywhere. So yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? But you can't have everything. And I'm not saying that you can, but I think
Ben, you can always do that later. That's
exactly.
The thing. It feels like you're selling out when you're doing it. You change something and you say, well, I didn't get exactly what I wanted. But you can always make that modification. A few years ago, I did exactly what I was just talking about. I took laminate countertops out and put quartz countertops in. I could do that 10 years after I'd done the remodeling. I couldn't do it at the time that I was doing the kitchen remodel the first time. So you just have to be realistic. There's a huge part of realism in this whole process. And I think when we are thinking about either building new or, really rethinking the existing house, we think, well, this is my dream and it's got to be perfect. And I try to help people see that there are incremental steps that you can take to making it just the way you want it.
Now, where are you then in this whole journey? Because architecture was obviously where you started out, but not so big, had more elements, really. It wasn't just houses. So what do you do on a day-to-day basis these days?
Well, my life is quite a bit different than it was when I was originally writing The Not So Big House. Some of your audience may know that I also wrote a book called The Not So Big Life, which really was how it was that I got to start writing in the first place. I actually gave myself a life remodeling. And I had always been aware since I was a little kid that there was more to life than what meets the eye on the surface. And I really wanted to probe that some more. And I wanted to learn more about how did I think? How did my world get created the way that I experienced it? And one of the things that I realized very shortly after beginning that, I call it inner work, was to see that I was always describing myself as too busy. And I started to think, now, why is that? Because life doesn't inherently have to be too busy. And I started to look at my inner architecture of my world. What were the beliefs and the fears that kept me on this kind of rat wheel trying to go faster and faster all the time? That was an incredible eye-opener. And it allowed me to actually, one, recognize that my true passion was writing, and two, make time to write. And so I went through a period when all the Not So Big House books were being written, where I would designate a chunk of time. It was actually on Tuesdays and Thursdays, where I would just write. I was still an architect. I was still doing all the things that I used to do, but I would write in those periods. And interestingly, as you put effort into something that you love, your world sort of organizes around that. And so, as some of your audience may know, I'm one of those Oprah Winfrey lucky people that got onto her show, and my life changed dramatically. And I was able to start doing more public speaking, more writing, still did a little bit of architecture. Now, fast forward to today, I'm actually teaching people about how to remodel their own lives along the lines of the Not So Big Life, look at some of the inner conditioning that has kept us away from the things that we really love. And I do quite a bit of that work. And then I also still do some public speaking, and I still do some writing, and I still do some architecture. So it's, I've got fingers in a lot of pies, but I am not nearly as busy as I used to be. That's the big one. It sounds like, how can she do all those things? But I'm doing them in a much, much more balanced way. And, I wouldn't trade it for the world.
How much of this was a spiritual journey?
It was a big part of it. It was really looking at, who are we really? That's really the question. And if you look at almost any spiritual tradition, the biggest question is, who am I? And that was really, I didn't realize it at the time I was asking, why am I always too busy? But at root, I was starting to look at what makes me tick. And then gradually in any spiritual journey, you'll start to realize, who is this me character? How did I create this notion of myself? And also, how can I learn to let go of patterns that are really not useful so that more of the natural capacities that each of us is born with can express? And it's a very powerful process, and it gives life another dimension. In the Not So Big Life, I talk about learning to see with a new pair of glasses that reveal another dimension. And that other dimension, it's sort of trite at this point. We say, be here now. But it's really about learning what it means to be present in what you're doing. When you're completely present, it's vibrantly alive. So no matter what's happening, you can be having a very frustrating day, but it can also be vibrantly alive because you're learning and you're seeing things about yourself that you couldn't see if you weren't present in the process.
Well, I think you've hit on something that's incredibly important. I'm just going to try and tie it back a little into the housing, because that's obviously what we do here. But I'm just interested because it's a massive project when you build a house. And
Yes.
Some people think it's going to be the answer to everything. Now, I have thoroughly enjoyed this journey, but I think that's part of the point that, I've just loved blogging about it and talking about houses all the time. But I'm well aware there's another side where it can go horribly wrong, or you can run out of money and it can just turn your life upside down. So do you think that there is sometimes, too much of a draw to try and build this dream house?
I think A lot of people have the desire to find home. I actually think this is where these two worlds intersect. There's the desire for feeling at home in our lives, and we start with, well, let's make a place that really feels wonderful to live in. So I think it's a very natural desire, even if it's just fixing up your existing home. There's something about it that makes us feel like the place is reflecting us back to ourselves better. So I wouldn't discourage people from that dream, but I would really encourage people to think about, what am I engaging? I'm actually looking for that sense of home in my life. And you can do it without building a house.
That was my point, is that, I feel sometimes I've lived in, I have effectively, although we're talking about scale, I've upped scale. It is, I think, the right time in my life if I'm ever going to do it, but I was perfectly happy back in the much smaller houses, and, life didn't change. You learned a lot by going through the process of building the house. And that's really the point. We think the point is the product. It's great living in a house that you've designed and built. But the actual living through that process, however difficult it might be, is actually an immense learning experience. And so you came into this with what sounds like a pretty positive point of view, and you took, I'm sure, the challenges that came your way and learned from them and engaged your audience with them. That's fantastic. That's the way that we can use every moment of our lives when we're really engaged and present and it's happening. But the house itself, it's a nice byproduct, but it's not actually the point. The point is the living through whatever it is that we're making. And that's true whether it's about writing a book, or whether it's about building a house, or, raising a child. All of these things are about, how are you as you engage this process? Anytime there's frustration, you can learn from it if you are not blaming others, but are looking at, what can I learn from this situation? And that's really how house and life sort of come together, because everything can teach you. And how do you live these days?
Well, my existence, I have, I think, the perfect situation. I can go for a walk in the morning, meditate. I usually start work late by most people's standpoints. I start probably 10:30, 11 in the morning. I work for probably 2.5 hours. Sometimes it's writing. Sometimes it's working with the builder. This morning, for example, I was on a call with a builder, working out some details for trim on a house that I'm doing. Then I have a nice lunch, and then often in the afternoon I will work with students on this Not So Big Life material. And so I have sessions with students, and I try to, if I'm in a big writing project, I try to save my mornings for that, because I find if I turn my email on right away, I'm involved in the world of answering questions.
Other people's agendas.
Yes, exactly. I just have to just keep everything silent. I'll meditate and then I'll write. And those are honestly my favorite times, because things feel very, very balanced then, very calm. It's a lovely way to start a day.
Well, it's been a lovely chat. Thank you so much for making time for us. And Once again, thank you very much for all your great advice that has gone into this house.
Thanks, Ben. And I want to tell you, your house in U.S. denomination is 2,500 square feet.
That sounds more like it.
Yes, and that's actually about what I say when people ask me, how big is a not so big house? They can be any size, but that's probably right around the average in this country for a not so big house. So even though I know in the country in which you are living, that may not be seen that way, if you're following my principles, that's probably why you ended up with 2,500 square feet.
And did you take that whole interview to work it out, or had you had it on the piece of paper for a while?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. I had it figured out early on, but when I had to ask you to repeat a question, that's why, because I was trying to multitask. It does not work.
Love it. Oh, I must get my wife to listen to that bit, because she says she's brilliant at multitasking. You see, it does go both ways. Sarah, thank you so much, and hopefully chat to you again sometime.
You're welcome. Thanks so much, Ben.
Get more online in our show notes today at houseplanninghelp.com/243, where you can review all the main information. We always provide a summary for you. Perhaps you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question. Well, there's a place to leave them at the bottom of the show notes. We'll link you to Sarah, the Not So Big series. She's got a few different websites, and also we'll point to where you can find her on social media, houseplanninghelp.com/243. Enjoyed that one. What's new in the Hub? Well, firstly, what is the Hub? It's our membership community. We try to help you on your self-build journey. If you're in those early days of researching, well, that's ideal, because we've tons of ideas, tons of material to take you through at your leisure from the comfort of your own home. But just what we've built up, we're hopefully everything that we put in there is just helping to enhance your thinking, in topics like this, scale, whether it might be what build system you're going to go for. We've lots of useful information. We've got, in fact, I'll tell you about some of the new stuff. So say, for example, we've got our monthly conference calls. Well, we've just chatted to self-builder Mike Coe. He was our guest this month, and he put together a presentation of where he's at in the construction process. So you might have heard Mike on the podcast before. Well, what we sat through is effectively the superstructure of his house going up, and we were able to ask questions as we went through that process. Most enlightening for me was how actually he discovered a thermal bridge in part of the steel for this building, and that's yet to be rectified. But it just makes me think that is perhaps something that we should create. How do you spot a thermal bridge? We know the importance of it, that it's just going to channel either the cold or the heat into your house. So how can you make sure that you've got one over on the architect? Because it's not as if they haven't got architects on their project, and builders as well. But Mike, I think clearly just showing his knowledge there, that he's got an eye on these sorts of things. This month's video looks at the concrete pour on my own project. We took a lot of video throughout that process, and we're just gradually turning it around for our members month by month. So new video in this month also looks at the first blocks going down. So now effectively out of the ground. It's going to be a passive house, a masonry build, and we will follow that over the next few months. Working on a new course. I'm not going to tell you about that quite yet, but we've got our courses there, trying to lay things out for you step by step. The private members area as well, where you can be kept accountable and also network, mingle with like-minded folk. All of that. What more could you want? houseplanninghelp.com/join. Go and have a look at what it's all about. Next time, my guest is Jenna Spessard from the Tiny House Giant Journey vlog and website. And really looking forward to this, because it follows the theme a little bit of what we've been talking about today. You can go all the way. You can go to tiny house living. Is it right for you, though? That's what we'll discuss next time. I hope you can make it. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.